Scala Kessler as we begin our third topic for the course, Learning from Indigenous Worldviews. The focus of this topic is to help familiarize you with theories of learning that emerge from Indigenous peoples' accumulated wisdom, their values and experiences, their ways of knowing and being in the world. You will be introduced to a range of Indigenous education frameworks that can be applied to policies, practices, and the curriculum of schools. I'm going to first discuss some of the underlying themes within the education frameworks that will be shared in the conversations and readings within this topic. I'd also like to use this opportunity to introduce you to Sarah Davidson, a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia, who is supporting this course as a teaching assistant. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Jan. Jan invited me to join her here today to both introduce myself to all of you and also to talk a bit about how I have taken up some of the concepts from the Indigenous education frameworks in the classroom. I have worked with adolescents and adults in the classroom for close to 10 years, and during that time I have drawn on many of the concepts from some of the Indigenous education frameworks in my practice. We thought that it might be useful to share some more practical examples as we work through some of this material.
And this is great, Sarah, as this will be helpful for us. Educational processes that are really committed to redressing an educational past, changing the way we do things in educational settings today, and making places of learning responsive to upcoming generations of Indigenous learners to ensure their success must also be committed to creating, supporting, and sustaining learning environments that reflect Indigenous ways of knowing. Culturally responsive approaches to education have been telling us for a long time now that when learning ignores the cultural and linguistic backgrounds of students, there's resistance and there's lack of engagement. And I'm suggesting, as have many others, like Gloria Ladstone-Billings, who pioneered this very concept of culturally responsive education, that when we accommodate for the values that students bring to learning, their patterns of communication and behavior, sources of knowledge that they give priority to, and their histories of living and learning, it is then that we can really engage them in learning. Indigenous knowledge systems play a role in creating learning environments that are culturally responsive to Indigenous students. But as I've said previously, approaches to learning that are inclusive of Indigenous ways of knowing have benefits for all learners. Leading Indigenous scholars such as Linda Smith, Marie Batiste, Brian Brayboy, Graham Smith, Joanne Archibald have all described for us the contributions of Indigenous knowledges to places of learning in their scholarly work. And I'm not looking here to describe a single definition of Indigenous knowledges. Rather, I want to sensitize you to what you should be appreciating and listening for in the conversations that follow in this topic, as well as reflecting on the materials that you will be reading. The Indigenous education framework shared with us in this topic, while quite different in the context from which these emerge and the ways they're given expression, have some commonalities. These frameworks are described as values or principles and represented as visual models. As I describe some of the commonalities within these frameworks, I want to be careful not to overgeneralize these worldviews, as I really think it's important to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have very complex ways of thinking about the world. But I do want to characterize and explore some of the underlying values and experiences, as well as perspectives that will help give meaning to these frameworks and their application to educational settings. What we see in these frameworks are approaches to learning that are holistic. They emphasize social, emotional, mental, and spiritual aspects of learning. These frameworks advance ways of knowing that are experiential, land-based, tied to narrative, traditions, and promote intergenerational learning. And I know, Sarah, you want to share an example of one of the frameworks with us in your teaching.
I'm most familiar with the First Peoples Principles for Learning. They were initially identified in relation to English 12 First Peoples, which is a high school course offered here in British Columbia. Though they don't represent the pedagogy of an individual First Nation, they do reflect some of the ideas more broadly. Currently, they are also being used to guide the development of the new First Peoples curriculum and classroom resources. Basically, these principles focus on how learning is holistic and supports the well-being of the learner, the role of multiple generations in learning, Indigenous knowledge and the associated protocols, and the importance of relationship and connection both to people and land.
You know, Sarah, these principles for learning bring to mind recent work by Linda and Glenn Goulet in their newly published book, Teaching Each Other, Cree Concepts and Indigenous Pedagogies. Similar to the First Nations principles that you've introduced us to, they've drawn on principles from Cree thought and addressed their application to the classroom. What is helpful to understanding their application are the stories by educators that accompany the explanations of the concepts, much like the way you're sharing your experiences here with us, Sarah. These stories of educators and the concepts come together to form a model that identifies important features to be considered when creating classrooms that will successfully support Indigenous learners. At the core of this Cree model of effective teaching are relationships. Relationships are central within all the frameworks revealed in this topic. Relationships to self and one another, creating connections to the land, the ancestors, and the material world around us. These frameworks are expressed through those relationships. Further, they describe for us sources of knowledge, what counts as knowledge, and processes of conveying knowledge.
Relationships have really been at the heart of everything I do in the classroom. I genuinely believe that it isn't possible to engage in any kind of learning if a relationship has not been formed between the educator and the students in the class. In my own classroom, I use journals with the students. This was a place for them to write about experiences in their lives and for them to share those experiences with me. In return, I would share those stories my stories with them about my life. The students enjoyed reading the short pieces of information I shared with them about my family or about a time when I was embarrassed or proud. I have also used personal narratives with students to provide a different perspective for them to consider and also to develop relationships with them. I have found that in sharing stories from my life with the students, I am able to establish connections. These do not have to be stories that are personal. Students are often interested in anything from what time I get up in the morning or what I ate for breakfast to a time when my brother and I got into trouble as kids. I find that these stories help them to relate to me and to see me as a human being as opposed to just an educator. And I have found that sharing the stories in the journals and through personal narratives go a long way toward building these important relationships that are really the foundation for learning to occur.
I really appreciate the example that you've given us, as it really demonstrates the power of stories and the power of stories to create relationships. One way to help the participants of this course think about the characteristics within these frameworks is to reflect back on the history of schooling for young Indigenous people, where they were taken away from their family, they were taken from the land, they were taken away from their languages, they were taken away from the very rhythm of their lives. In this look back, we realize what was lost, what was taken from these children. And it's in the striking contrast, the striking violation of the residential schools and certainly other experiences of forcible child removal that we see how very different Indigenous ways of knowing are from those of schools. This comparison is not at all to suggest that current educational practices are similar to residential schools, but to point out that these ways of knowing may stand in sharp contrast to what we think schools should be about. Another strategy to help you make sense of these characteristics that resonate within these frameworks is to consider mapping these Indigenous education frameworks onto your own personal and professional assumptions about what knowledge and skills mainstream schooling values. You may see similarities, and you will certainly also see differences.
Actually, this idea reminds me of Elder Verna Kirkness's talk, where she discusses the work that she did with Ray Barnhart on the 4 Rs. Respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. More specifically, I think it connects with her discussion about reciprocity, where she spoke about the importance of recognizing the contributions that everyone can make to education, that educators should be looking to engage with students in a more give and take relationship, and the importance of exploring ideas together with no one being the expert. She also talked about sharing with the community and working with elders. She felt that we need to work together to know each other better so that we can understand why other people think the way that they do. We all have different values and we all bring them with us, but we need to understand and respect those values and each other.
Thank you. Finally, you will need to ask, how are you challenged by these frameworks and how we can implement them in policy and practices and the curriculum of schools?